Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the Revolutionary War. As you can see from this slide, there are quite a few terms for you to keep track of as you're watching this lecture. So if you need to, stop the lecture and go back and listen to parts of it again, please do so. Or of course, if you have questions, you can always ask me in class or send me an email or stop by my office hours. So anyway, let's get to it. Here is a quick review of what we have discussed thus far. The Continental Army began in April of 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Following the very bloody Battle of Bunker Hill, the colonists created the Continental Army and put George Washington in charge. A year later, after debating what to do next, the colonists formally declared their independence. But now what? How was independence to be won? Initially, the colonists were full of a fierce fighting spirit that was fed by early success. The first half of 1776 was a time of great excitement for the rebels. They had driven the British from Boston and officially declared their independence. One historian calls the excitement that filled the colonies as the rage militaire. Young men flocked to the Continental Army and to the colonial militias. Women perhaps best reflected the rage militaire, however. With access to British goods cut off by the war, American women spun thread into cloth and sewed that cloth into uniforms for the army. They also encouraged their men to sign up and fight for independence. This spirit among women was perhaps best displayed from the wife of John Hempstead. John Hempstead was a militiaman, and he said that his wife said, "After I got away, my wife called to me pretty loud. I stopped my horse and asked her what she wanted. Her answer was, 'Not to let me hear that you're shot in the back.'" End quote. Much of the enthusiasm began to die, however, after the British launched a new invasion of America in August of 1776. After the British withdrew from Boston in March, they began planning and preparing for how they would end the Revolution once and for all. They focused on the city of New York, a city where support for the Revolution was thought to be soft. It was also the second largest city in the colonies, and one of the most important ports. The British attacked with 32,000 men, in other words, a large army. Washington's Continental Army was nearly destroyed in the attack. However, they managed to slip away at the last minute in a retreat that saved the Revolution. Washington's defeat at Long Island led many to question the revolutionary cause. Soldiers refused to re-enlist once their term of service was up. Washington's army dwindled to a mere 3,000 men. Thomas Paine reflected the desperation of the time in another pamphlet, this titled "The Crisis." As he wrote in the crisis, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls," end quote. The defeat also encouraged another group within the colonies, the Loyalists. Not everyone supported the revolutionary cause. Thousands of colonists still supported the British Crown and wanted to stay within the empire. These individuals were known as Loyalists. Historians estimate that 15 to 20% of the colonial population were Loyalists. As this map indicates, these Loyalists were concentrated in specific parts of the colonies. New York City was indeed a hotbed of loyalism. So was North Carolina. This map also indicates that Native Americans played a big role in the American Revolution. Indians saw the Revolution through their own experience. In other words, when they picked sides, they did so with their own interests at heart. Some, especially those with lands that were surrounded by colonial settlements, felt they had no choice but to support the Americans. Others remained neutral. Most, however, sided with the British. Why? Tribes such as the Cherokee argued that the Americans were a threat to Indian lands. The British, they said, would restrain colonial settlement and protect Indian interests. In fact, they had done so with the Proclamation of 1763. The Shawnee and the Delaware, on the other hand, tried to remain neutral, that is, until American attacks on their lands and their people made that impossible. The Mohawk, too, joined the British, largely due to the influence of their leader Joseph Brant, who had ties with the British. Another outcome of the Declaration of Independence was the need for some sort of national government. Given their experience with powerful government that, in their opinion, had overstepped its authority and turned tyrannical, the Americans sought a new system that had limited power. The new government became known as the Articles of Confederation, and it was written in 1777. Today, the Articles of Confederation is seen as a government that was a failure, largely because it was too weak. A common criticism is that the Articles gave too much power to the individual state governments, and not enough to the national governments. Indeed, the Articles declared that, quote, each state will retain its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, end quote. And so, how did the Articles of Confederation give power to the states? Well, first of all, representation within the Articles Congress was by state, and each state had equal representation. It didn't matter how large your population was. Every state had one vote. Every state had one vote within the Articles Congress. Moreover, before a bill could become a law, 9 of the 13 states needed to approve it. Amendments to the Articles of Confederation required unanimous approval. Once again, this is giving power to the states, especially those states that are small, because a state with a tiny population like that of Delaware had equal voting power to a large population like New York. And so again, that gives power especially to the small states. The Articles also reflected the colonial fear of despotism. One of the problems in the years leading up to the Revolution, they claimed, was that the king was simply too powerful. Thus, the colonists sought to eliminate the problem by creating a government without a king and without an executive at all. Nor was there an independent judiciary or court system. Still, many historians today who look back on the Articles of Confederation try to see past the fact that this government was discarded in favor of the Constitution, and instead say, if we look at this government, we can see that in fact it was not really a failure. Instead, these historians say that this was a government that was, given the situation, remarkably powerful for its day. Given that it was a government that promoted considerable unity among the recently independent colonies. This is a rather remarkable thing when you consider that the colonists had been very independent. They had been used to working on their own for more than a century. And now the Articles of Confederation brings them together and makes them work together. So some historians say that the Articles were, in fact, a very successful government. For example, it was a government that had the power to, first of all, it's not such a weak government, I should say. It's a government that had the power to declare war. It had the power to make treaties with foreign nations. It had the power to mediate disputes between the states. It had the power to borrow and print money. It had the power to request money from the states. This last one, however, understand, it didn't have the power to tax the states. It didn't have the power to tax the people directly. It could only request money from the states. And so this is probably a legacy of the problems that the British government had in trying to tax the people directly. The Articles of Confederation didn't want to fall into that trap, so it did not give its government the power to tax the people. Another reason why historians look back at the Articles of Confederation and see a success is because it really did manage to accomplish 2 rather remarkable feats. The first involved conflicts among the states. Those conflicts arose from claims to the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Each colony, with the exception of Maryland and Pennsylvania, claimed western lands. Some based their claims on their charters from the British government. Some even claimed that their territory stretched to the Pacific Ocean. The map to the right indicates the extent of those claims. Note how far to the west they stretch. Also, note how in many cases they overlap. Both New York and Virginia, for example, claimed the Ohio River country. Massachusetts claimed parts of what is now Michigan, and Connecticut claimed parts of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The Articles of Confederation negotiated these disputes, convincing the various states to turn their lands over to the federal government. It went further than that, however. In 1784, the Articles Congress passed the Ordinance of 1784, which created a process by which these territories could become states as their populations grew. The Ordinance of 1785 created a process by which lands in the West could be surveyed and sold. The ordinance declared that the minimum price for the land would be $1 an acre. This was going to be very important because, again, remember, the Articles government does not have the power to tax. And so where they're going to get their money is by selling land. This is how the government is going to fund itself, is by selling land out west. Finally, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 divided the territory up into smaller territories that would eventually become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Somewhat remarkably for its day, it also forbid slavery north of the Ohio River and created a process whereby the government would fund and provide for public schools. Again, that's pretty amazing. The other accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation was fighting a war. This government was such a failure, then why did it win the war? The Articles government, as weak as it may be, figured out a way to pay for the war and for the troops in the field. It created a national bank, for example, to help stabilize the colonial currency. And it created a series of government offices that paid the bills and divided up war costs among the states. It might not have been pretty, but it did work. How did the colonists win, therefore? Well, mostly by staying alive and winning occasional battles. One of those victories was at Saratoga in New York, where a colonial army forced the surrender of a British force of about 5,000 men. The victory at Saratoga was significant, mostly for what happened next. The French had been considering expanding its support for the American cause. Oops, I'm sorry. Go back there. They hated the British and wanted to see them lose their American empire. However, they wanted to be sure that the Americans could win. In other words, they wanted to make sure that their investment was going to be worth it. Saratoga, the American victory at Saratoga, is going to convince the French that they could join the American cause. Excuse me. Everything will come together in October of 1781 in the Virginia city of Yorktown. A British army under the command of Lord Cornwallis was trapped by a combined army of French and American troops. Cornwallis hoped to escape by sea, but these hopes were dashed with the arrival of the French fleet. He had no other choice but to surrender his army of 9,500 men. This, as I said, this ultimately led to the British surrender. Now, the war would drag on for another 2 years. However, for all intents and purposes, independence was inevitable. Yorktown made it clear to the British that they could no longer conquer the American colonies. They decided to cut their losses and make peace. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the 13 colonies, but it did more than that. It also set the boundaries of the new nation. Those boundaries were incredibly generous. They stretched south to, but not including, Florida. They went west to the Mississippi River, and they extended north to the Great Lakes. Now, when Native American tribes, such as the Shawnee and the Delaware, who had fought with the British, heard of this treaty, they were outraged. They argued that they had defeated They argued that they had defeated the Americans and that the British had no right to give away lands that they saw as their own. Now remember this, is because this is going to be important. It's going to sow the seeds of future conflicts in the years after independence. That's all we have for now. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have questions, again, please come see me in class or see me in my office hours or send me an email. Thanks a lot.